What a privilege to have Rob's Jumpstart right in front of me here. I've never done PowerPoint before, so I'm going to be one of those Luddites that tries to toggle through and entertain you at the same time. I got a call from Mike Glazier. Mike, you're not here. We miss you. We wish you were. He invited me to come talk at TEDx, and I knew about TED, and my first reaction was, great. And then I read through his email, and it said, the theme is, why not? And literally in 10 seconds, I had my theme. Why not add chocolate to beer? My background is the craft beer industry. I also work with a lot of artisan producers, cheesemakers, chocolatiers. I love combining the two. And the histories and the stories of beer and chocolate lend themselves to this talk. So, public service announcement number one, please respect beer. Some of you aren't 21. Even if you are over 21, beer is something that you should consume in moderation and respect. Eat food with it, enjoy it, but respect beer. Number two, it's American Craft Beer Week. This is a national promotion from the American Brewers Association promoting beer and food and tastings and pairings. So a double whammy for us having TEDx during Craft Beer Week. So why not add chocolate to beer? If you think about civilization, it can be argued that beer caused civilization. This is a quote from Michael Jackson, the singer, not the Thriller. Michael Jackson spoke many times in Philadelphia at what was the Book and the Cook series many years ago, where chefs would come in and work with restaurants and talk about their cookbooks. His beer event was the best-selling event at the Book and Cook for years. It was at the Penn Museum of Archaeology. You're amidst all of these relics and beautiful artifacts, and you're pouring beer. A very, very interesting cultural phenomenon. Beer is also worshipped when you think about Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess, and there's been tablets and poems written about her, and King Midas, and many people in many cultures have been dietized by beer. The Egyptians built the pyramids using beer. On the chocolate side, when you think about the Mayans and the Aztecs and how they ritualized cocoa, cocoa was a currency, cocoa ruled, cocoa was for the riches. So we're going to tie all these things together as we go along. The basis of beer is barley. The oldest barley has been found 23,000 years ago in the seas of Galilee. It was found in pottery shards, archaeological shards, about 7,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. So beer does go back to early man. And the question is, what came first, beer or bread? Beer is liquid bread. Bread is solid beer. And a lot of the old cultures used bread in a slurry or a stew, and they let it ferment, and it naturally fermented with the yeast in the air, and it became a little alcoholic, and it was safer to drink than the water. So beer certainly is a touch for old civilizations in the history of man. There's a wonderful book by Patrick McGovern, who's a professor over at Penn, an archaeologist, called Uncorking the Past. He's brewed beers with Fritz Maytag from Anchor Brewing. He brewed a beer called Ninkasi in 1993. It had a lot of honey and herbs in it. It was more towards a mead, but it had a barley base. It had a bread base. He's also done several collaborations with Sam from Dogfish Head, the Midas Touch, and some of the series that Sam's done from archaeological evidence too. So barley and grains are grown in 100 countries. You've got corn, millet, wheat, grown in Africa, Asia, South America, mostly grown historically for beverage. So here's a picture of some barley harvest. Most people think of wine as agricultural and cheese as agricultural, but beer is beer. Well, beer is very much agricultural, especially the craft beer. This is a picture of a couple sisters in Eastern Oregon who are harvesting barley for a farm that the Rogue Brewery owns, where they're actually growing some of their own malt and then curing it, malting it properly for beer. So it's the new thing in microbreweries, is to own your farms, own your hops, own your barley. I'm going to step back to an email from the CompuServe Bacchus Forum in 1994 that came through, and it reads, beer is a woman's occupation. Beer is a woman's power base. It is the basis for all political, organizational power that women have had and enjoyed. Women maintain power and status in a male-dominated society by their skills as brewsters. They continue to do so in non-technological societies today. This was written by an anthropologist, Alan Ames, who wrote many books on beer. This was an article in the Beer and Tavern Chronicle. He also reproduced a beer from Brazil called Zingu that is no longer being made, and he's no longer with us. But it was an adaptation of a beer brewed by women in the Amazon that he brought to the market in the US. So as we talked earlier about the monks and how they screwed up music and scores, thank you, Dan, that was great. They really screwed up beer. Women brewed beer up until the Dark Ages, and at the point that European civilization was kind of battling and forming, the monks took control of the breweries. They did so for money. They did so they could control what people were drinking. There was a lot of strange things like wormwood in the beer, which caused a few strange dreams. And again, beer was much safer to drink than water, but the monks really took control of the beer. They used a lot of herbs. When we talk about the flavors of beer, barley and hops is probably the one thing that people talk about. They want bitter beers, IPAs. They know their hops, they know their styles. Well, hops really didn't get used in brewing until, well, in this 1629 in the US when it was first planted. But in the 1400s, it was outlawed at times because they didn't understand what hops were and what it did. They understood their gruit and their wormwood and all the flavors that they had been using for years. But hops imparts many flavors. You get citrus, you get woody, you get spruce, you get floral. The traditional German and Czech hops, like Saaz hops that you'll get in Pilsner or Kel, are very clean bitter. You don't have those floral notes that you get from some of the new hybrids. If you go on to some of the websites from hop growers, Hop Union is out in the Washington State, they have 80 types of hops available to brewers, both home brewers and commercial brewers. There are hop geneticists at Oregon State University coming up with new hybrids, and it's a fascinating field, and it's all about the flavor. So we hit 1516 in Germany, and the Bavarians decided that they wanted to control beer. The monks were brewing it, but they wanted to control the ingredients. So they wrote this Reinheitsgebot, the German purity law, and said you could only brew beer with hop, barley, and water. This is pretty much the style of American mass-produced beer today. You can look back at Pilsner or Kel, which has had one of the longest histories as a brewing company, and then Budweiser, Miller, Cortes, et cetera. They're just pretty generic lagers with not a lot of ingredients. The Reinheitsgebot lives on today, but some of the Germans are now starting to say, hey, we want to brew like the Belgians and add all these fun flavors to our beers too. I don't blame them, but that's the history of it. The unsung hero of beer is yeast. And it wasn't until Pasteur looked under a microscope and started looking at it and working with some brewers from Carlsberg that they understood what yeast brought to beer. Yeast has only been around in the brewing industry for 130 years. It's a new addition, a new known addition. Until then, it was spontaneously fermented. If you go to a brewery in Belgium, they don't sweep the cobwebs. They don't sweep the floor. What's in the air is what ferments the beer. It's part of the terroir of the beer. And it's very important because it's their house yeast stamp, and yeast has so many different flavors. If you go onto websites like Yeast or White Labs, who sell yeast to both the wine and the beer industry, you'll see dozens and dozens and dozens of types of yeast, depending on whether it's an ale, which is a top fermenting beer, the English style. It brews very quickly. It's got a very fruity and floral flavor, to a German lager or Pilsner, which is a cold fermentation, and it takes much longer, very crisp and clean. Yeast really imparts a very interesting signature and flavor to beer that is kind of the unsung hero, because unless you're seeing it in a carboy like this, which is what homebrewers use, you don't see that spontaneous combustion. Unless you watch a type presentation at TED and you see the letter A being spontaneously combusted by yeast, that was a sweet moment. So we move forward to the 20th century, and these guys in DC passed this thing called Prohibition, and it really killed the beer industry. Before 1919, there were a couple thousand breweries in the US. Beer was local. New York City probably had 100 breweries. I know Philadelphia had over 100. They grew the hops and barley nearby. Beer was always local until you got industrialization, transportation, cooling, packaging. The can came out in the 1930s. So Prohibition took all of this cool stuff that was happening and stopped it. There was some bootlegging. People like Yuengling actually made ice cream, probably brewed beer as well, but they sold ice cream. In 1933, the government decided that Prohibition didn't work, and in most states, except poor Mississippi, which had to deal with it until 1966, beer came back in the market. But at that point, things had changed because it was the big boys that were able to come back and survive. So I'm going to step away from beer for a minute and talk about chocolate. Chocolate has an interesting history. If you go back to Peru, the Olmec were growing chocolate long before the Mayans, and the Mayans and the Aztecs really ritualized it. The cocoa beans were used as currency, as I mentioned before. There was a recent National Geographic article, actually, I think it's about 5 or 6 years old. Archaeologists discovered chocolate in vessels that were 3,000 years old. So this was the first chocolate beer that was brewed. And I didn't know about this till last week, which is exciting. It did have alcohol in it. So the fermentation of the cocoa and of the barley, spontaneous yeast, and whatever they're sprinkling into it, created a beverage that they used for ceremonies, most likely, put in special pots. Those things were put under a microscope by people like Pat McGovern and analyzed, and there is this historic 3,000-year-old chocolate beer. So Columbus comes over to Central America, and he sees chocolate, and he sees cacao, and he doesn't get it. And he burns the whole load that he's got in his ship. He just thinks it's like rat turd. Does not get it. Cortes drank the Kool-Aid. He was hanging out with the Mayans and the Aztecs at that point. He understood what chocolate brought to their society, and he brought the beans back, and he started planting it in the places where Spain had cultivation that was proper for growing chocolate, which was probably in Africa. The Spanish held on to chocolate. It was for the rich. It was for the mighty. They didn't even want other Europeans to have it at first. It finally did leak out, but a lot of people didn't like it because it was bitter. So, of course, these people have sugar plantations, and they start adding sugar to this chocolate. And they start adding cinnamon and other flavors that they're bringing and exporting. So the beverage at these high society places, and the first chocolate bar that opened was before the first coffee bar in England. There was actually a chocolate house where people would go and drink chocolate. Chocolate was liquid until 1847, when the first molded chocolate was made. When you think of Hershey's, which is probably the most well-known, or Asher's, which is an old Philadelphia name, their chocolate isn't that old, 100 years old. But think about how much they produce. And unfortunately, like beer, chocolate got commoditized and became general. You could put the word chocolate on a bar, and it could be 10% cacao in the US. In European countries, it could be 1%. Think of all the additives that are in there that are not chocolate. So this revolution starts happening where people start thinking about the ingredients. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you get chocolate into beer. Here we've got roasted malt, cocoa powder, the little jars of liquid chocolate, Hershey's Kisses, Hershey bars, chocolate chips on the far, and then cacao beans and pods. And those are added either during the boil at the beginning of the brewing or to the finished beer. And it gives it a different taste depending on how it's actually cooked in. The same way with barley and malts, wheat and rye, you roast it to a certain flavor. So the darker the roast, the higher the Dries Levaban, the stronger the taste. We're going to move forward because I think I'm over my time now. Here's a selection of some of the beers made with chocolate in the US, and Costa Rica on the far right, and Canada, aphrodisiac. The Elysian Pestes actually got Chilean chocolate. It's named for the Mayan apocalypse series that they're doing. And in addition to chocolate and beer, you can put beer and chocolate and beer and cheese. The Rogue Creamery makes a chocolate stout cheddar using a type font called Brewer, which is an old type font. And the folks at Vosges make a chocolate stout caramel bar. So in closing, I just want to suggest that think outside the pint glass. Here were some beer gummy bears I got at a trade show, little gummy bears made with beer. And Googling it the other day, I found a brewery in Alaska that's making a beer with gummy bears. So respect beer, think about the flavor, enjoy things, and happy American Beer Week, folks. Thank you.